Hi, I'm Michelle Segrest, and welcome to the Factory of the Future podcast. This podcast is inspired by my 3-volume book series on the evolution of modern manufacturing. Each episode features engaging conversations with game-changing experts discussing the processes and innovations that are changing the landscape of modern manufacturing. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and leave me a 5-star rating on iTunes and take just a couple of seconds to leave a review. And then go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single episode. I have a really intriguing and interesting conversation for you today. I'm really excited. I have with me a longtime friend and colleague, Alfred Kennedy. He has spent many years working with groundbreaking technology that helps manufacturers from all industries become more efficient, more innovative, and more forward-thinking. I'm just so excited about the conversation today. Alfred and I are going to talk a little bit about how smart city technologies could be adopted to developing smart manufacturing plants. We will discuss how manufacturers are safely getting people back into their facilities in the time of COVID. Many companies are using smart technology to accomplish this. They are getting some cool ideas from the technology that many smart cities are using. Digitalization in manufacturing is not new. It's been around for a while, but the challenge has become finding innovative ways to make it new and fresh. And finding new ways to collect and analyze big data is an ongoing quest for forward-thinking manufacturers. Urban centers all over the world are struggling to cope with booming populations that place an increasing demand on resources such as energy, clean water, and clean air. They are striving to find innovative and sustainable ways of dealing with noise pollution, ever-increasing urban traffic, and the effects of climate change. They're looking for resiliency and accomplishing this with smart technologies. The question is no longer whether cities should incorporate digital technologies, but when urban projects will be scaled up on a global level. The same is true for manufacturing facilities. In smart cities, driverless trains are operating at higher capacities. Energy networks are becoming smart grids that adapt quickly to changing demands. Different city infrastructures are interconnecting, and some of these technologies translate naturally to smart factories and manufacturing plants. I've heard that this model has been called City 4.0, which I think is interesting because that obviously relates directly to Industry 4.0, which describes the impact of automation and data exchange on manufacturing. I am really excited to welcome Alfred to the podcast, and I'm ready to dive right into a deeper discussion of how smart manufacturing facilities are inspired by some of these smart city technology. Welcome to the show, Alfred.
Hi, Michelle.
So nice to have you here. Before we get started on our conversation, please just tell us a little about yourself and your background and experience and explain to the listeners why you're an expert on Industry 4.0 and smart manufacturing technologies.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this podcast. I'm really excited to be here. My background, actually, I have over 20 years of strategy, marketing, and sales experience, 11 of which was in Siemens. While I was at Siemens, I actually was responsible for strategy, marketing, as well as sales of digitalization offerings into the process industries. So I've actually been in this space for about 6 or 7 years now in total. Actually, when GE first launched the Internet of Things, Siemens also jumped in full force. And at that time was very integral in helping to launch several offerings that we had in the space, asset and energy analytics, which ended up being Siemens MindSphere over time, as well as our cybersecurity offerings. In addition to that, I actually have been attending a great deal of IoT trade shows over the last 3 or 4 years. And in fact, I've kept doing that even during this pandemic. A lot of companies have been doing a lot of trade shows just virtually. Obviously, there's no in-person trade shows at this point, but I have been attending a lot of those shows. And it's very interesting to see how things have been changing or in some cases staying the same as they
That's
were
right, yeah.
over a year ago. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see what's new and coming out of this environment at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting that these trade shows are now virtual as well. Even the trade shows are adapting to this world of interconnectivity.
Absolutely.
And I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the things that you've learned at some of these trade shows. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the podcast, so I'm excited about that. Welcome again. It's just great to have you here. Your level of expertise really is diverse and far reaching, and especially with regard to digitalization. So I'm just curious in general, what do you think the future of manufacturing looks like?
It depends actually really on the company and the people who are at senior levels within the organization. I really do believe that a lot of ways businesses are no different than us as human beings and individuals. Those of us who are very progressive, let's say when it comes to adopting or early adopting of technology, we also kind of take that into our work environment. And so a CEO is very interested in having his whole house connected. I would not be surprised if he's also one that's pushing digitalization throughout his company.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And the vice versa is true as well. If you have people who are not interested in technology or they think that their business is just fine and doing it the way they've been doing it for the last 30 years, they're probably less prone. And in fact, I've met both kinds of groups of people, to be honest with you. And it's very interesting. The ones that are really progressive and really interested in technology, like I said, they have Alexas in their house. They have everything connected, their lights in their garage doors and everything else. And then you have some companies that are still using clipboards and stopwatches to run their processes.
Wow, that's pretty amazing to think, huh? So it's just like the old-time operators that walk around the manufacturing facilities and just put their hand on the machine and feel for the vibration,
Exactly.
are now having to learn how to use technology to remotely monitor that vibration. It's pretty interesting.
I will say that the thing that is most intriguing to me about that is that those companies that have been using the old methods and have not started to adapt to what the next generation of workers is interested in doing when they're on site, it is going to become more and more poignant of an issue, because those employees, that early career professionals, quite frankly, they are coming out of school. They're used to doing video games that are almost lifelike. They're used to everything. They're digital natives. And so they're ready and willing to come to the workforce. But I would really caution those companies that are not interested in learning or adapting to the new technologies to be very careful, because very soon they're going to have a challenge backfilling roles when the aging workforce continues to progress along that we're seeing here in the industries.
Yeah, that's been an ongoing topic for so many years, this aging workforce.
These companies that are, if they're not adopting new technologies that allow them to optimize their plans, to allow young early career professionals to gain the knowledge through hands-on or maybe even through virtual reality training, they're going to miss out on this workforce. And quite frankly, that is, to me, probably the greatest reason why, outside of maybe regulations, outside of other things that could be driving different updates to your manufacturing plant or facility. Right. The reality is that if you don't update, you could just miss out on the workforce.
That makes perfect sense too. Yeah, because these guys are, this next generation coming up, they're techies. And they understand technology and they want smart technology. Somehow there's a gap between the old guys that are walking around with all this knowledge but don't know how to use a computer, and then the new guys coming up that will be running these facilities, or they're the operators now, and they have to have a combination, don't you think, Alfred, of the smart technology side of the brain, but then also they have to understand how the machines work.
They do. And in fact, I was reading an article just yesterday about Honeywell, and they have some new technologies where they're using VR or base simulators, so virtual reality simulators, to train up the next generation of workers. And then these workers, once again, they're used to video games. So key question in training up the next generation has been years, is how to take that knowledge base of the older workers, to your point that you made earlier, the maintenance guy that can put his hand on the motor or some other rotating piece of equipment and know from the vibration that it's got an issue and it's going to need maintenance. How do you train up that next generation? If that person, let's say, is now retired and they haven't been able to bring in new personnel. Well, you can actually, through digitalization and through training, you can actually capture that knowledge. That older gentleman or older person can actually, all that data that he has, he can actually input into the computer, or somebody can, do it just like we're doing a podcast.
Right.
And then
Right.
translate that into actual support for a virtual reality training process. So, you'd have to have obviously some three-dimensional replications of your plants and maybe even the motor or other rotating piece of equipment that the person would put their hand on. But then it would at least sense and feel what that person could do, but also at the same time be trained on other things, fire safety and all kinds of other things.
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk about some of this specific technology. I will never forget the first time I met you. It was at WEFTEC 2017. So it's been a few years. And you showed me this really cool technology from Siemens that allowed manufacturers to virtually place equipment around the room so they could more efficiently design manufacturing facilities. I thought this was really interesting. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that particular technology?
I don't recall the name of the technology off the top of my head, but it was augmented reality is essentially what it was. So my colleague, if you recall, was using an iPad. And what you would do is you could take that iPad and put it somewhere on the show floor, and then you could click a button and it would put down or drop down virtually this drive that was maybe 5 feet in length, and it was a very large piece of equipment.
Right.
And so when it would drop down, you could then see where it would be in space, and you could understand, you could even open up doors and look inside and different compartments within that virtual version of that drive. But the reality is that you could also, to your point, you could see what it looked like on your footprint. So if you were in a plant and you had this technology, you could go in and you could say, okay, well, I want to look at where I'm going to put this pump or whatever. And you could then virtually look and see how it would fit within your manufacturing space.
It's so interesting because when you talk about designing a manufacturing facility, or when you already have a facility, but you want to add equipment and you want to know where to put it. This stuff is heavy and it's bulky and it's hard to move around. And especially if you already have equipment in there, you want to already know before you get it in there exactly where it's going to fit. And you want to make sure that, like, if you open the door to the big drive, that you're not going to hit another piece of equipment, or it's not going to block a walkway or put the person standing there in some sort of danger. There's so many things to consider. And when you can look at this virtually, that really helps things for the person designing that space.
It does. And it actually, that plays into the whole, there's been this big push over the last X amount of years into not just digitalization, but more importantly, creating a 3D model of your plant or a digital twin. I know that you've heard that term many times.
Digital twin technology,
And I've heard it from many people. It depends on what your definition of a digital twin is, but kind of the holy grail of a digital twin is to take a brownfield plant and literally create a digital version of every asset within that plant. Ideally, if you could do that, and you can do it through, obviously, if it's already created, you would have to have drones fly through the plant. And I know that Bentley Systems has some really good software that allows you to go in and it's called context capture, where basically you take a picture of it, it'll help you render a 3D model or 3D image of that. But the point is that this digital twin is the holy grail, because ultimately, once you have that, you can do what you're saying. You can then figure out, if I'm going to switch out this piece of equipment, and I know the specs on that piece of equipment, more to the point, I know exactly the specs I need to have for that piece of equipment. And I can then see if it'll fit in that space. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, what's really big about digital twins is that you can then have an avatar, going back to the training that I was talking about earlier. It's really important, because then you can have people go do it virtually, never be on the shop floor. They can actually do training sessions, even take tests to make sure that they're ready to go on the shop floor, so that they know what's dangerous, what to avoid, where the hotspots are, or toxic chemicals, or whatever it is that you're concerned about within your plant. So the safety training is really important that you can do once you have a digital twin, but you can do so many other things. I think that once digital twins do become more mainstay, I think what will happen is that you'll start having other business cases that they can do. Training is the big one right now.
Right. That makes sense.
But there will be other ones that will come along.
Yeah, that's fascinating. All this stuff, to me, I think it's so cool. And when you see it in action and you see it, as you said, in the virtual reality space, it's really interesting. How long has this technology been around? Do you know? Hasn't been around too long.
Well, it's interesting. Let me say it this way. I don't know the exact date of when it first came around because it depends. Like, I know Bentley Systems has been touting doing digital twins for years. It just depends on what your definition of digital twin is, number one.
Right.
In Siemens vernacular, we had multiple options for digital twins. You had the plant digital twin, is what I was just describing. You have the process digital twin. So you could actually have a digital twin of your process. So let's say your distributed control system within your chemical plant, you have it set up and it's running. What if you change this or that or the other parameter in your process? Well, with a digital process twin, you could actually beta test that in virtual, in a virtual world. And then if it's going to work and it's not going to affect something that causes hazard or whatever, then you can actually move that directly. Once you've created it in the digital twin and it's working and you tested it out, you can pull it into your distributed control system and it'll just automatically make those changes. And you've now, like I said, you've beta tested it and it works. And now you've rolled it into the application. So
very fascinating stuff.
So there's multiple digital twins. So there's a digital twin of your process. There's a digital twin of the actual physical plant. There is, in Siemens vernacular, there's multiple digital twins. So when you're talking to somebody about a digital twin, you have to kind of really understand what they mean and what they're looking to do. Because ultimately, I think there's a lot of manufacturing that is going through a metamorphosis. So if you think about, for instance, the power industry, especially the coal-fired power plants, those are being shuttered for the most part. So they're switching over to other kinds of energy development. I was talking to a gentleman who was with Schneider Electric, and he was telling me that he also was a salesperson in selling, obviously, Schneider's wares when it comes to digitalization offerings. And he mentioned that he was working with a customer, and I believe, if I remember correctly, it was a power plant, just like we were talking about. Well, that's what this company did. I mean, they were a small utility, and they only had power plants. I mean, they didn't have like wind and solar and something else. So essentially, 5 years, 10 years down the road, their business is going to come to an end. That can happen. So how do you pivot from what you were doing today into kind of what you were talking about in your intro, making sure that the power grid, how can they move from a energy provider to maybe a service provider? So now they're buying energy from point A and giving it to customer B, as it were, versus actually generating it themselves. And how can they move through that? How can digitalization help them to think through what their next 30, 40, 70 years of their company is going to look like?
That's really interesting. And that's a really great segue into something else I really wanted to talk about. You told me that some of these events, these virtual events that you've been attending, have talked a lot about the smart city technology. In the intro, I did talk a little bit about this. I really want to hear about this. I want to hear about some of these smart city technologies that can translate into smart manufacturing plants.
It's interesting. So let me just talk about smart cities for a second, because I think that's
please.
a really interesting space. When we're talking about digitalization, there's some spaces that have been capturing data. Some industry has been capturing data for 30 or 40 years. I mean, if you think about the chemical industry and the power industry and oil and gas and all that, they've had data historians for 30 some plus years. So capturing data out of your rotating equipment or out of your PLCs or distributed control systems or whatever has been happening for years and years and years. And so when you talk about digitalization, it depends on the person you talk to, but some people are like, oh, well, that's old hat. That's been around. It's nothing new. With all these online companies like Amazon that are obviously need major distribution warehouses, ultimately, those are being very automated. So the reality is that when we talk about automation and its acceleration in industry, smart cities and also warehousing and logistics are two of the major places where it's really starting to capture and get.
Well, tell me about some of those technologies. What are these smart cities doing?
Yeah, smart cities, a couple of things that I have seen. I've seen actually really cool technology when you have sensors along a road, and as a vehicle is coming down the road, if it's exceeding the speed limit, a speed bump will pop up. And,
that's so cool. That's crazy.
Yeah. And so if it exceeds the speed limit, it'll pop up. If it doesn't exceed the speed limit, it'll stay flat. And so
Does it pop up like right when the car's on top of it, or does
no, no.
is it, because that would be bad, right? So it pops up a little
Yeah,
bit. It sees you coming. It sees you
absolutely.
coming at a fast pace and pops up ahead of you.
And you would
And
see it, coming too. It's not like it's not going to pop up, as you said, like right underneath your tire, and then all of a sudden, pop your tire or something like that.
right,
It does give you time, but the reality is that it also allows those who are obviously law-abiding citizens and keeping the right
yes,
speed limit. Then, which obviously I don't know how many of us on this call would really be like that. but
I
but
happen to go fast on occasion.
but I mean, I will tell you, I remember when I was in college and I worked for Domino's Pizza, and that was back when they had the 30-minute delivery guarantee.
Right.
And subsequently, I used to drive fast because it was kind of like beat the clock. And if they had these
Sure.
kind of sensors in residential areas, quite frankly, I would have, myself as well as my colleagues, would have never been speeding around because that would have, we would have damaged our cars, quite frankly.
Right.
So there is this kind of technology out there. There's also the lighting poles that you would have in cities are getting very, very smart.
And you're talking about like at a crosswalk.
Yes. When somebody comes up to a pole to, let's say, go to your point at a crosswalk and push the button so that they can get the light to turn green and so they can walk across it. That, especially in a COVID world, is a bit of a problem because then I've touched it and 1,000 other people have touched that. And who knows what kind of viruses we've spread or germs that we've spread by touching that. It's just like a car. If the car comes up to the traffic light, eventually the light changes because the sensors underneath the cement or the macadam recognizes that the car's weight is there. The same thing is being done with human bodies on the cement around the traffic light pole. So as they're standing there, it'll sense that somebody's there and it'll automatically go ahead and change and you don't have to push the button anymore.
That's really fascinating. That's cool.
Yeah.
And I can visualize how this can translate to manufacturing, like how manufacturing facilities can use this kind of technology in a facility. Like, for example, when you talk about the speed bump thing, when you're in a big facility and there's a lot of equipment running and it's all dangerous, but then you also have these lanes that you have to stay in if you're walking through the facility, as you know, and sometimes a forklift comes by.
Oh, absolutely.
And, I can't see a speed bump popping up because that would be bad in a facility, but I could see a sensor there that says, okay, around this corner, some people are standing there that maybe send up an alarm or something saying, get out of the way or something like this. So I could see how it could translate a version of it to manufacturing. And
that's right. That's right. So it could just be an alarm. It doesn't have to be a speed bump. A speed bump just happened to be in this case. But I mean, it's no different. I mean, if you think about it, this also is not really that new of technology in the sense that we've trains coming down the train tracks for years. Obviously, the train, the trestle comes down. Well, the train is a mile away or, half a mile away or whatever and before that trestle comes down. But in your car that, whoa, wait a second, the train's coming. I don't want to start going over the tracks. You can't even see it sometimes, and yet it's still come down. The same idea is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
But so it's just taking, and actually a lot of ways, it's very interesting. A lot of the new technology, and I think that maybe also play into why when you talk to some of these folks that have been in process industries or in manufacturing facilities for years and years, they are a little bit jaded about the topic of digitalization because they're like, well, we did that like this, all these years ago.
Right. Sure.
So you can see that, but I think the difference is that when it starts to impact us, not just at a train trestle, because that doesn't happen very often, right? But when we're actually interacting, if we're to your point, we're on a very busy work floor and obviously you always have, to your point, forklifts and all kinds of things moving around. It's a very dynamic environment. And in something, to your point, if you pass a sensor and all of a sudden alarm goes off because it also senses somebody's there at the corner. So it not only senses the forklift, but also senses the person. Then it'll send the alarm off. If there's no person there, no alarm.
Right. So it can keep going.
It's really an interesting, dynamic, and wonderful time to be in manufacturing because of all these new things.
Yeah, that's interesting. And also, I was thinking about the stoplight. Okay, if you're standing there and you don't want to touch the button because you don't want to get COVID or the flu or you just don't want to get dirty or maybe it's cold, you have on gloves or whatever. And the sensor is under the concrete, right? And it feels the weight of a person. So they know there's a person standing there. So we're going to put the light on so you can cross the street. Well, I could see this translating to manufacturing as well, particularly in COVID times where the COVID guidelines for safety are strict. Like maybe they can only have 10 or 15 people in a room where they have an assembly line or something. And in order to stay 6 feet apart, they have to manage how many people are in the room. Could it possibly sense, hey, there's 16 people in the room, there's only supposed to be 15, so some sort of alarm goes off?
You can do that. There's also, you could do it as sensors underneath the cement or underneath pads or whatever you have on the shop floor there. But I think that there's probably another way, and I know there's other ways that you can do it. So for instance, Siemens owns a company called Enlighted. And Enlighted puts sensors in industrial lighting banks. Okay, so they're in commercial buildings, they're in industrial buildings. These sensors, though, can basically pick up on heat, and you can affect the lighting. And basically, with these sensors, there's a couple things you can do. One is you can pick up on heat patterns within a room, the ambient temperature in the room. You'll know from that how many people are in the room. You can also set up geofencing. If you put, let's say, your tag or badge that you wand into the building with, you can have a transponder in there. And then with the sensors and the lights, it'll know where you are at any time. So it actually helps if there was a fire or something like that. You could easily know where people are. You could get them out. But also to the point of you were making about COVID, you can set up geofencing and know exactly how many people are in a room. If there was more than what was allowed because of the guidelines, let's say there was 10 people, typically we were allowed in the room, but now we're only allowed 2. It would sense that there's 3. And so an alarm would go off.
Right. Okay.
So absolutely. There is a lot of technology that can be done both in a commercial building, but also used in a manufacturing plant as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. I find all of this so incredibly fascinating. I want to kind of go back. You mentioned really briefly earlier in the conversation a little bit about augmented reality, but I want to talk about that some more because it's known for years that ingenuity begins on the consumer side and then it translates to the industrial side.
That's right.
I have a very cool article on my website about augmented reality, and I was just researching it and writing it. It was so fascinating about how humans and machines are connecting with each other through augmented reality. And this is really changing the face of industrial manufacturing. One of the first versions of augmented reality was the first line marker on the football field. When you're watching a televised football game, that yellow mark, the people on the field can't see that, but we can see it through the TV. So we know when they made a first down, but that is augmented reality. So if you kind of put that into perspective and think, okay, that's a version of augmented reality, but in manufacturing, they're really using this augmented reality in ways that are just fascinating. Do you know some examples or have you seen some examples of this in manufacturing facilities?
The best one is, as I've said before, is through training. And so it allows you to your point, you can actually take somebody into a space and without them physically being there, or if they actually, another one that I've seen is something you sent before. You talked about maintenance. I've seen it used in that space too. So somebody comes up to a motor or a drive, let's say, and they're just inspecting it. And they have the iPad with them. They're standing in front of the motor or drive. And now all of a sudden, all of the critical details about that drive or motor comes up, right?
Right.
And and if they have a VR headset on, they can actually have somebody telling them, maybe there's a third party, once again, person that's in the control room. They can say, hey, look, why don't you do this, this, and this? And it'll make the tweaks and changes that they need to make, and it'll improve the performance of that rotating equipment.
Yes, it's amazing. You put it in front of it, and the whole inside of it pops up in this like virtual, like you can go inside the machine and see where the problem is.
It's just like the old illustrations of the blow parts. So, you could see the inside of a machine, but it's now virtually, you're seeing it there in front of you, and it just helps you to visualize what is going on and where you need to make the changes.
Right. And you see the inside of the machine standing right in front of the machine. So if you're a very visual person, like you're a very visual learner or doer, it shows you how to fix the machine while you're standing in front of the machine and kind of takes you inside. And to your point, you can have a third party standing there like you're on a Zoom call. And they can be say, okay, first you do this, now take this tool and do this. And they can walk you through the steps that the operator needs to fix that machine. It's
Correct.
pretty amazing.
Yeah, and we're talking about you can take the senior level people that are maintenance people, they can be in the control room or wherever they need to be while their junior colleagues are out there on the shop floor making these changes. They have the headset on, they have hear what their colleague is telling them, and they can make those changes right on the fly. It's so very important because, as we talked about with the aging workforce, you could even have these people, they don't even have to be in the same building, right?
That's right. They can be home. They can be home in their living room.
Exactly. I mean, so they could be, let's say it's a maintenance, which typically happens, always happens late at night, or it happens on the weekend, right?
That's right. Always.
Absolutely. So you have this fire drill, and obviously somebody cannot live at the plant. So at the end of the day, there is somebody always there, but it may not be the person that knows that piece of equipment the best. And subsequently through this, you can actually get them on the phone. They can actually walk them through because they can see it, but they're both seeing the same thing at the same time.
That's right.
And actually literally help them do whatever that is.
Right.
Actually,
walk them through the steps and show them how to do it. Not just tell them how to do it, but show them how to do it in real time. And to even expand that example even further, a lot of these facilities, and you talk about digital twin technology too, a lot of these facilities are exactly the same. That maybe they have 20 facilities throughout the world, and they're all the exact same layout, the exact same equipment, exact same machines. Well, maybe the expert is sitting in Germany somewhere, and the operator is sitting in St. Louis, and the expert in Germany can get on this virtual augmented reality call and walk him through how to fix that machine from a whole other country, from somewhere else. And that saves money too, because you don't want your experts having to, and especially now you can't even travel that much, having them go to visit the facilities anymore. They can do it from wherever they are.
It's a really interesting dynamic with COVID, right? Because I think that there has been a massive amount of increase in automation in use of these technologies, quite frankly, because it really does lend itself to your point. You can be in a separate country and you can still get the work done that needs to be done, but and have the experts right there. So it's not, it's not like, somebody is tinkering with something that they're not.
Well, I think it also, we've had this, like you said, a lot of times we've had this technology. A lot of this technology has existed for a while, but I think the reality of COVID has introduced the technology to a lot of new people. Like my parents didn't even know that Zoom existed. I've been using Zoom for a long, long time, but now that we're having family Zoom meetings, now they know what Zoom is. They didn't before. So in some cases, the technology exists, but just not enough people are using it. And now I think that because of the sign of the times with COVID, we're being forced to use it because we can't get on a airplane and fly across the country or to another country and help somebody fix a machine. We need to be able to do it remotely.
Right. I think that there has been a great increase in some of these technologies being adopted because it does allow you to do things and it actually allows the whole social distancing to happen. It allows, all of those things that we're concerned about where we're getting too many people in a certain space. Traditionally, that's how you did it. I mean, obviously, if you're a journeyman plumber or whatever it is, they are obviously going to be there with the master plumber or whatever it is, master mechanic. They're going to be right there, hand in hand, watching how they do it and then learning and then doing it themselves, right?
That's right.
Well, with COVID, it makes it a lot more difficult to be that close together because, I mean, you're obviously, then you've got some concerns there. With this technology, it allows you to not have to do it, but they're still doing it. It's really interesting. They're still there. They're just not there, like literally, butting shoulders with each other. So it's great.
Right. What do you think some of the manufacturing trends are right now? What do you think will be some trends that impact Industry 4.0 and smart technology in the next year? We're in 2021 now. So what do you think we should be looking out for?
I don't think there's going to be anything necessarily new from a technology standpoint. I think there's going to be more of an adoption rate standpoint is going to be the big change. So I think you're going to see more and more companies adopting these technologies because COVID is not going to necessarily go away tomorrow.
That's right.
So I think we're going to continue to see adoption rates, very high adoption rates. I think you're going to continue to see companies adopting automation equipment. I think the manufacturers of automation equipment will probably continue to do well in this next year's economy. So I don't see anything new technology-wise per se. I will say that maybe some years down the road, there's some things that are coming along. I was in this one event that was sponsored by Case Western, and there was a professor there that was talking about how basically the combination of robotics and humans is going to merge over time.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really adamant about the cyborgs that we see in Star Wars.
Right. They're coming, huh?
He kind of sees it that way. And I don't know if we're going to get there. I mean, there's lots of, obviously, moral and all kinds of other topics that get involved with that discussion. But the reality is that you do see where if they can provide sensors on somebody who's lost their arm, maybe in a manufacturing accident, right? And they've lost their arm. And now they've gotten a prosthesis, and that prosthesis can sense, the sensors get so good that they can control the hand so well that it's basically, even though it's not the full dexterity of a human hand, it's darn near close, to be honest with you. And I think that is going to be where you could see, especially in a manufacturing plant, where if you have heavyweight things being could put on, things that could give them more energy, or it's kind of like the Bionic Man almost. To
right.
me.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's exactly what I was thinking.
It is. Oh yeah, it's just like the Bionic Man, and you can now all of a sudden pick up things that you would never be able to pick up just with human strength, but now you have this additional strength with whether it's a prosthesis or it's a gloves that you've added on to over your I don't know, an exoskeleton, whatever you want to call it.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's really quite far-reaching, I think, at this point. I don't think manufacturing would want to touch anything like that at this point. There's lots of automated robots.
We're seeing them everywhere. They're all over manufacturing. They sure
Absolutely.
are.
Absolutely. And especially as we were talking about earlier, warehousing environments. If you think about warehousing, that's a real easy way to get hurt typically. I remember when I was young and I had a full-time job as an unloader and loader of 18-wheel trucks. And we'd take the refrigerators and the freezers off of those trucks. And those things are massive, and I'm struggling to get them off the truck. And
right.
Honestly, it was pretty dangerous work, especially if you're trying to lift that. Think about this. You're trying to take that into somebody's home, into the private residence, and you got to take them up 3 flights of steps to get into the residence. That is A, very tough work, and B, it's very dangerous work. Talking about easily somebody that could put out their back or
the refrigerator could fall on top of the person and smash them. I mean, there's so much that could happen.
Absolutely. And translate that now into a warehouse where you have all of these refrigerators and freezers and all these other big pieces of equipment that people have purchased, and now they got to be moved around for shipping and everything else. Well, if you have automated robots doing that versus a human being, now you've eliminated any potential of injury.
Right.
I would say that area is, in particular, as Amazon and all the other online retailers, and as we get more and more used to buying online retail, which has happened also because of COVID.
Right, exactly. It all overlaps.
People have really gotten to the point where they don't need to go into the stores anymore, which is not
That's
good
right.
Retail, but retail online has improved, which is an offset. But the point is that way, I think you do see some very strong growth when it comes to automated and in robots and things like that.
Well, I have a couple of takeaways from this conversation. And one is that when you talk about the bionic arms, I'm thinking, okay, the speed bumps that pop up and things like this, I think we can safely say that sensors are no longer just for measuring temperature and vibration. I think we've come a very long way, and it's just going to get more and more exciting and creative and smart. I mean, smart's just the best word to use it. And then, of course, the other takeaway is how this time of COVID has really accelerated our need for factory automation and for smart technology and for more Industry 4.0. I want to give you the last word as we kind of wrap up a little bit. First of all, again, I want to thank you for being here. And this has been a really fun conversation. And of course, I want to have you back at some time because we have so many things we could talk about. But for now, I want to give you the last word. Just anything else you want to say about how manufacturers are using digital technologies to advance Industry 4.0 and just what you see the future of manufacturing looking like?
My last word is that, first of all, thank you for letting me join today's podcast. This has been really a lot of fun.
It's been my pleasure.
It's a really exciting time in manufacturing. I have worked with a lot of university students over the years, either through teaching adjunct at university or all the many research projects I executed with university students across the United States when I was at Siemens. Manufacturing in a lot of ways gets a bad rap. I think, everybody thinks that the shiny thing is to go work for Apple or Amazon or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you that there's some very progressive manufacturers out there. In fact, I was talking to Koch Industries just this week, and they were telling me about that they have developed their own in-house software group and digitalization team and all these other groups that are working with the latest technology and figuring out and actually even developing technology that they'll sell to other manufacturers. Interesting enough. My comment is that, especially to the early career professionals that may be listening to this, don't be so short-sighted and not look at manufacturing, because there's a lot of great opportunities out there to be at the ground level of these new technologies being implemented. And
that's perfect. Yes, that's perfect advice. I really appreciate that. Alfred Kennedy, thank you so much again for being here.
Well,
and I want to let the listeners know that if you have any questions, we will have Alfred back. Send me some questions to my email at michelle@navigatecontent.com, and we'll get him to answer those questions for you. And if hopefully he'll be back. You'll be back, won't you, Alfred?
I will, of course.
This brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on iTunes. If you have interesting information to share and want to contact me about being a guest on a future episode of this podcast, please send me an email at michelle@navigatecontent.com. You can also send me questions that I will have my expert guests answer for you on a future episode. And in the meantime, please check out my book series on modern manufacturing to read more than 30 real-world case studies about how global companies are using smart technology and innovation to build the factory of the future. All the links to the books and articles mentioned in this podcast are in the show notes. Have a great week, and please join me for the next episode of Factory of the Future.